Hello everyone, this is Direwolf20 and welcome to my test world where I am about to do a Computercraft demo of the Reactor control program that I've been using on ForgeCraft. So this is a bonus video, it's extra content, it's specifically tailored to those people who are interested in Computercraft programming. This video will entirely be composed of Computercraft programming, so if that's not for you, sorry, but if it is for you, then stay tuned because we're going to go into depth about how the Reactor code works that controls the reactor and the turbine and all that cool stuff that I've been doing on ForgeCraft. So this is a Computercraft tutorial dedicated to big reactors, reactor control program. Let's take a look. So the first thing you want to do is get the pastebin codes that you are going to need. There's two pastebin codes that you're going to want to get. The first one, pastebin get, this code is the button program. Okay, and I've made one or two little changes to that button API, so if you've got it in the past, you're going to want to get a new copy of it. I only added one little feature to it, but you know, it's something you're going to want to grab. The other code that you're going to want to get is this one, and that's the Reactor program itself. Now, when we run the Reactor program, there's two options that'll happen. First off, if you do not have a turbine hooked up, and you can tell that this is not plugged in currently by this thing, and the other thing you're going to want to make sure is that your reactor is not set up in steam producing mode. That's what's actually really the most important piece, is whether or not the reactor's in steam producing mode. So even if this is turned on, it doesn't matter. See how this is currently set up to steam producing mode? The reason for that being that we've got this coolant port right here. So if we were to go ahead and change this so that we had reactor glass there instead of the coolant port, and the same for over here, we've got a second reactor coolant port. If that's glass, you'll note that the reactor is now no longer the type of reactor that generates steam, but instead the reactor that generates energy. When you turn on the program, it's going to automatically detect that based on that information. One or two minor changes you're going to want to make to the code here. You're going to specify where the monitor is. So for here, we're going to do right. And when you edit the reactor, the only thing you really need to worry about is the number of capacitors variable right here. This specifies how many capacitors are plugged into the computer. The only thing that's important for is something we'll see in a minute. It's really not that important that you change it, but it'll make the information displayed on the monitor correct. So let's go ahead and run the reactor program. You might have to reboot. And there we go. We should see the reactor program start up. You'll notice that it automatically starts up in automatic mode, which means that the reactor is going to try and keep your capacitor bank full of energy. And there's thresholds on how full it should be. And that, again, is in the code. If you want to change it, the first couple lines here, turn on at 50%. So when the reactor hits 50%, or when the capacitor bank here hits 50%, you're going to go ahead and turn on the reactor. And then when it hits 90%, is when it'll turn off the reactor. Okay, so you can change those numbers right here, no problem. And if we run reactor again, we'll see that we also have the ability to control things manually. So if we hit the manual button here, you can turn on the reactor, and when you do that, you'll see that the reactor is now generating power, the temperature is going up, the RF gen is going up, the fuel use is going up. And of course, we can insert fuel rods at different levels and thresholds here. So you can bump it up to 60, increase it by 1 with these buttons over here, bump it up to 90, whatever you want, and that'll adjust how much RF power gen and core temperature and fuel use you're going to have. So by setting it to 0, there's no fuel rods inserted, meaning that you've basically got full blast power. When in automatic mode, it will always use 0%. It won't adjust based on any fuel rod usage. It'll just constantly full speed when it's below 50, and then once it gets up to 90% energy stored, it'll automatically turn off. So as a demonstration, I've just replaced my capacitor with an empty capacitor bank. I'm going to run the reactor code again. It should automatically detect that the energy stored is less than 50%, so it will automatically turn on the reactor. Once the reactor or the energy stored in the capacitor bank reaches above 90%, it'll automatically shut off the reactor. As indicated on the screen, the energy use represents the change in energy in the capacitor over time. So every few seconds it checks, and it will automatically detect how much energy is going in or out of the reactor. A green number is positive, a red number is negative. You can also see the RF generation, whether or not the reactor is online, the core temperature, and the fuel use per tick. And you should see now once we hit about 90%, it will go ahead and trigger the reactor to automatically shut off. There it goes. RF gen slowly declines as the reactor shuts itself down and the core temperature drops, and our energy stored number will kind of hang out there at 91%, and then once it drops down to 50, it will go ahead and adjust. Remember I told you that you need to adjust the number of capacitors in the code so that if you are, for example, trying to store energy, like so, you'll note that the energy drop is 20,000 RF per tick. If the code was not properly modified, for example, if we said we only had one capacitor, that number is the only thing that would be wrong. It now says 5,000 instead of 20,000 because the computer is only reading one of these capacitor banks, and since it's 20,000 RF per tick leaving the whole thing, it's basically dividing by 4. So we need to just multiply by 4, so that's where that num capacitors variable comes in. And now that number is accurate. That's the only thing that does, is make the energy use number accurately represented. If you don't care that much about that number being accurate, you don't have to change the variable. The program will work just fine without it. Pretty cool. Now, when the reactor is configured as a steam turbine reactor, like so, if we were to get ourselves some reactor fluid ports, this will be the cool water going in. This will be the hot water coming out. And we'll throw some speed upgrades in there just to make sure it's correct. Now the computer automatically detects whether the reactor is a steam turbine or not. You just have to restart the program. And it should automatically detect that this is a steam reactor. What it's going to do is first, it's going to get the core temperature up to around 100 degrees C. Once that's complete, it'll wait about 5 seconds with the fuel rods inserted 99% of the way. What this is going to do is it's going to allow the computer to calculate what roughly 1% running speed can generate in terms of steam. So the way the steam reactors work is they generate a certain amount of steam, and you need to dump that steam into the turbine. The most you can dump into a turbine is 2,000 millibuckets per tick. So what we're going to do is calculate how much 1% fuel rod gets, and then we're going to adjust the fuel rod level to try and get close to 2,000 millibuckets per tick. Now I purposely add a couple numbers here, a couple levels of fuel rod insertion, and then slowly back down, because the hotter the reactor runs, the more efficiently it runs. So if I took that calculation and immediately applied it, I'd wind up generating more steam than I really need. So I basically probably would have come up with about 65% right now, and that would have been too high. So I throw it up a couple, I think I get it up to like 70, 72, and then I slowly back it down. So every couple seconds I drop down until we get to about 2,000 millibuckets per tick or more. That's when I stop with the calculation. Now I determined that 68% is the optimal fuel rod level for this reactor to create 2,000 millibuckets per tick, or slightly more. In this case, slightly more. So again, the manual and automatic mode is pretty much the same. During automatic operation, the energy stored, when it drops below 50%, it will turn on the reactor, and when it goes above 90, it'll turn off. However, things operate a little bit differently here than you would expect because of the fact that we now have a turbine control. And if we right-click on turbine, we'll be able to see the turbine's functionality. We can see how much energy is currently in the reactor capacitors still, and the energy stored capacitor amount. Now we can see whether or not the turbine is online. The turbine should pretty much always be online. That's whether or not it's accepting steam. But what happens is we turn off the RF generation or the steam generation, so we turn off the reactor steam generation there. And when you check this out under Reactor, you'll see how much steam is being generated. Right now, 0 millibuckets per tick. When we turn on the reactor, we'll see that it can produce up to 2,000 millibuckets per tick, or like I said, slightly more. We'll switch it back offline here and switch it back to automatic mode. And the turbine can accept that amount of steam. You can see how fast the rotor is going. The optimal rotor speed is around 1,840 RPM, and that's also a variable. What the computer program will do is it'll try and keep it at that number. If it's above 1840, it turns off the reactor, and if it's below 1840, it turns on the reactor. And in order to get power out of the turbine, all we need to do is have the coils engaged. Currently the coils are offline, which means they're not engaged. That's why they look blue on here. When the coils, this button here, engage coils versus disengage coils, are engaged, it will slow down the spinning of the turbine rotor, and it will generate power. So when we hit that, you'll see that now we're generating power. We're generating around 22,700. And like I said, your optimal speed's 1840. So as the rotor slows down, we're actually generating more RF. Once we hit that 1840 number is when we're going to be generating our maximum RF. And then as we drop below 1840, you'll notice that we start to generate a little bit less. So we're still generating more and more. And then once we pass 1840, we're going to start generating a little bit less. And that's the point at which we should turn on our reactor. So 1840, and now it starts to drop. So if we switch to this guy to automatic mode, what he would do is he would disengage the coils because we don't need any more power, we're above 90%, and he would also turn on the reactor until we get to about 1840. Let's watch. In automatic mode, the reactor goes on, steam is being pumped into the turbine. Once we hit 1840 RPM, it'll turn off the reactor. So even though we're not generating power from the reactor, we want to keep that rotor right close to that 1840 RPM level. And you'll notice that as soon as we hit 1840 RPMs, the reactor shuts off. Cool. And the way the turbine works is when the rotor coils are not engaged, it will slow down, but at a very slow rate. So it will maintain that 1848 RPM speed for a good while, and it will take a while for it to drop below 1840, at which point the reactor will turn on for a second, bump it back up over 1840, and then immediately shut off, keeping it right at that perfect number. Pretty cool? So now let's dive into the code and figure out how it all works. So there's a couple things we do first, and the first thing you typically do in code is define some variables. So first we load up our button API, which makes it so that we can have these fancy buttons with a little bit easier coding style. And then we find all the peripherals we want to hook into. The first peripheral we'll find is a capacitor bank, and we'll name that variable P. We also find a monitor, that's variable M. We'll find a big reactor's reactor, that's variable R. And we'll find a big reactor's turbine, that's variable T. So these four variables represent the four blocks that we're connected into. So when you want to use this program, all you really need is some wired modems and some cables from Computercraft. Hook them into a capacitor, a monitor, a reactor, and a turbine. And it'll automatically find them for you without you having to know their name. Pretty fancy. You also want to determine whether this is a steam reactor or not. So that's using big reactors as an API, which you can plug into, and we're going to be seeing a lot of what the big reactors stuff gives you. One of the variables is actively cooled. True if it's a steam reactor, false if it's an energy producing reactor. Cool. The menu type is reactor. That's whether or not we're currently on the reactor menu versus turbine menu. And that'll change with button presses, but the default is going to be set to reactor so that the first thing when the computer program loads up is the reactor screen. Number of capacitors is 4, I told you about that, and the percentages to turn off and on. Remember I told you the target speed is 1840. If you want to change that for any reason, be my guest. Maybe you want to have a reactor or a turbine that's running around 900. That's the other optimal speed. If you have a smaller reactor type, you can just change that variable and the program will adjust automatically. And then we just define a bunch of variables. How much energy there currently is, the energy stored, energy max, energy stored percent, timer code. We'll see what a lot of these variables do. The default mode is automatic. If you want this to be in manual mode by default, just change this to manual, and then when the program starts, it'll automatically start up in manual mode. I like it starting up in automatic mode because I always want it running automatically unless I'm there. And then RF production, fuel use, core temperature, reactor online, rod level. These are all variables that are displayed up here, and we'll find the information about them later. We're just defining them ahead of time. Turbine information, online, rotor speed, RF gen, fluid rate, and inductor coils. Again, all information that we're just preparing the variables for, so we don't have to worry about. And optimal fuel rod level. That's the number that turned out to be 68%. We want to remember that because the only time that's going to change is if we change the design of the reactor, which I'm going to assume you're not doing too often. If you ever change the design of the reactor by adding fuel rods or changing the liquid inside or adjusting the cooling features or anything like that, just restart the program and it'll automatically recalculate that number, and it'll remember that number going forward, so it doesn't have to recalculate it ever again until you restart the program. So using my button API, which you guys have seen in the past, I store a bunch of button information in a table. So we're going to set the automatic button and define the function that gets called when you call or press the button, sending any variable information, and then the X and Y coordinates of where that button lives. So you can see the automatic and manual buttons are in these X and Y coordinate positions. So that's just defining where those buttons sit. We also say if it's a steam reactor, so remember we checked if it's a steam-based reactor. If that's true, then we also add the reactor and turbine buttons at the bottom. That's how, when it wasn't a steam reactor before, we didn't see those buttons. And then we call button.screen, and then we'll see what check mode and menu mode do in a minute. Now in a manual menu, it's pretty similar. So when we're in manual mode, we want to call the manual menu function, and that's going to have the same automatic and manual buttons, but it'll also have the online and offline. And what I can even do, let's do this, we will bg edit reactor and then run the reactor program, so that as I'm going through the code, we can actually look at the code and see the reactor running and functioning all at the same time. So now you guys can see when I switch it to manual mode, all the buttons I define, online, offline, 0 through 90, plus and minus, those are all functions that are getting called. Typically all the numbers are called by the set rods, and then I just specify what percentage, so 0, 10, 20, 30. So it's the same function that's being called for all those buttons. We're just passing different variable information into them. And if it's a steam reactor, once again, we're putting the reactor and turbine buttons at the bottom that can be used. And then we call button.screen, which displays the information on the screen. It's part of the button API, which you guys have seen me use before. Check mode, reactor on off, and menu mode, which I'll talk about in just a minute. The turbine auto menu, this is how we define the turbine buttons here. So again, when it's in automatic mode, all we're seeing is auto, manual, reactor, and turbine. And in turbine manual menu, we see auto, manual, reactor, and turbine. And then we also see online, offline, and coils on or off. And remember, we don't have to worry about checking if it's a turbine because we would never get to the turbine menu if it wasn't a steam-powered reactor. So that's why we don't have to do that if-then statement like we did up here for whether or not to place the reactor and turbine button information in there. Cool? Reactor menu just sets that variable type to reactor and displays screen. And turbine menu function is setting the variable menu type to turbine. And we'll see about that in a little bit. But basically, it checks that variable and then determines which of these menus to display. And we'll see that later on in the code. Online just calls the reactor, remember R is reactor, dot set active to true. So when we're calling the online function, that's part of the reactor's online, offline button. So that just says reactor online true, reactor online false. And that's telling the reactor to turn on and off. And the same for turbine online and turbine online or offline. That's just calling it at the T, which is the turbine. So that turns the turbine on and off. The reactor on off, just remember that's the function that we call shortly after the display menu here. So turbine on off and reactor on off. So this is just checking whether or not the reactor is currently online or offline, and it shows whether or not to activate the button on the screen. So that set active is whether or not this is green or red. So if the reactor is online, it sets the button online to active and offline to the opposite of whether or not the reactor is active. So if the reactor is online, it makes it green, and if it's offline, it makes it red. That kind of thing. Same for the turbine on-off, coils on-off. So that's basically checking whether or not the coils are currently engaged and whether or not to display it as a green button or a red button. Cool? Coils on calls the set inductor engaged and set inductor engaged false. Those are just telling the turbine to turn the coils on and off. So whether or not they're engaged or not, it's turning it on and off actually physically. So this code here is checking get inductor engaged. This code here is telling the turbine to engage the inductor coil set inductor engaged. And finally, that menu mode, that's just making it green or red here. So if it's a steam reactor, it checks that first. And if the menu type is reactor, then the reactor button is green and the turbine button is red. Otherwise, the opposite, right? So right now we're in turbine mode, so the turbine button is green and the reactor button is red. But if we swapped that by clicking on reactor here, you'd see that being the case. So it's red and green opposite. Set rods is when we set the rod level. So we flash a button on the screen. So that's that set rods function I told you. We tell it what level to set it at. And then we tell the reactor set all control rod levels to that level. So if you have multiple rod levels, it sets them all the same. So when I call set rods at 30, it will call that code and set all the control rods to 30 right here. Ta-da! And the fuel rod level function is what actually displays this fancy little graphic over here. We'll see that in a minute. Rod plus and minus does the same thing. It just takes the current rod level and adds 1 to it or subtracts 1 from it. So that's just doing this here, 31 and 30. Cool. The check mode button just turns on and off automatic or manual mode, making them red or green. Manual mode, when you call that function, it sets the mode to manual and loads up the manual menu, which is that list of manual buttons that we saw earlier. And automatic mode sets the mode to automatic and then redisplays the screen with the automatic button function aid. So you can see that there. Cool. Comma value is a function that just takes a number value and formats it in a string with commas, so that when we have, for example, the turbine coils online, it puts a comma after the right point in the decimal. It's just some code I found online. I Googled for how to do that because it's a little above my knowledge level. But you can see it just, tracks down where to place a comma at the right numbers location. So display energy is an interesting function. This is what displays all the information at the top of the screen here. First thing we're going to check, is to clear the screen, set cursor position to 1, 1, so put it in the top left corner. We write to the monitor the word energy use, and then we, if the energy is less than 0, it turns the color red. Otherwise, it makes the color green, and it writes out that comma value. It sends the energy value, and then it puts the letters RF per tick there. Then it changes the colors to white, writes the word energy stored, and then writes out the energy stored %, which is a variable that we calculate in a minute. Then it checks if it's a reactor. So if the menu type is reactor, then we specify the reactor is online or not. So in reactor mode, it's displaying reactor is. And then it checks if it's online, then it's green. And if it's not online, then it makes it colors red and offline. And then we jump down to if it's a steam reactor, we specify the steam amount. And remember before we specified the energy produced amount there. And then we just basically check for that. Then we write out RF gen if it's not a steam reactor. Then we check core temperature and fuel use. Whether or not it's a steam reactor, we're still displaying that. So really with a steam reactor, the only thing we're changing here is the word steam versus the word reactor. Cool. Or RF gen, I mean. And then, if it's... So remember, the main thing we checked for is if we're currently in the reactor menu type. If we're not in a reactor menu type, we can assume we're in the turbine reactor menu. So in that case, we want to write whether the turbine is online or offline. And again, we do colors green or colors red, depending on which one we're writing. And then we also write if the reactor is online or offline. So I like to have both the pieces of information here, whether or not the reactor is online as well. And then it generates the RF gen, rotor, and steam variables are all written up here. Check N is where we check all these energy values. So display N, we just write it out to the screen once we've calculated it. Check N is where we check the energy values. So first thing we get is energy stored, is the energy stored amount currently in the capacitor. So remember, P is your capacitor. Energy max is how much it can total store, right? So the total amount it can store. And then energy stored % is we just round energy stored divided by energy stored max times 100. So we just calculate the percentage stored in the capacitor right there. Okay, RF production, we just take the reactor and get energy produced last tick. That's the function from big reactors. Fuel use, get fuel consumed last tick. And then we, round that down and multiply by 100 and divide by 100. The reason we do that is it writes out the fuel use. Like right now, I think fuel use is only displaying like a couple, like 2 decimals after the point. So by doing this, it sounds silly, but if you think about it, I'm multiplying the fuel use times 100 and then rounding it down. And then I divide by 100. So that just ensures that I have, so let's turn this on, for example. We can see the fuel use, it's only displaying 2 digits here, 0.58, 0.57. If I didn't do that, it would display like 10 digits there. It would be like 0.5639241, and that's just way too much information that you guys probably don't care about. So that was just a quick and easy way to get 2 significant digits there. There's probably a better way to do that, but, you know. Core temp, r.get fuel temperature. That's how we get the fuel temperature, current 98.6. We've got reactor online, and then we calculate the energy use. This is a little bit tricky because there's no direct way to find out how much energy use there is currently in this vibrant capacitor bank. So we'll calculate that by doing temp energy is the current energy stored. We wait 0.1 seconds, which remember 0.1 seconds is 2 ticks because there's 20 ticks in a second. So 0.1 is, you know, a tenth of that, so 20 divided by 10 is 2, right? And then we calculate energy as being the current energy stored minus the temp energy divided by 2, because we want to get per tick. And we waited 2 ticks, so we need to divide by 2 to get per tick. And then your energy change is your current energy times the number of capacitors. Because remember, I told you the energy change here is only for one capacitor. So when we multiply by the current number of capacitors we have, that's why this energy use information is accurate. So basically, we get the current stored amount of energy, and then we wait 2 ticks, get the current stored amount again, get the difference, and divide by 2. So when we turn this, for example, turbine, we will engage the coils. We should see no RF change. Even though we're generating power, there's no difference in the amount of stored energy right there. And then the final set of code is only related to steam reactors. We check whether the turbine's online, the turbine's rotor speed, the turbine's RF gen, and the turbine fluid rate. And that's just so that we can display the information on the monitor here. Turbine online, rotor speed, fluid rate, RF gen, that kind of stuff. Fuel rod level. This is the function that displays the fuel rod level right here in a nice fancy graphic on the screen. So what we do is we set cursor position 30,5, which is right about there, and we display the fuel rod level as a number and put the percent sign after it. So currently it's at 68%. You'll notice that we set the background colors to white, set the cursor position to 28.6, which is right about there, and we can go ahead and write a bunch of blank spaces. With a white background color, will look like that white blocks there. And then we go for the next 10 lines, we do the following. We set the cursor position to 28, and then whatever iteration we're at, so 28 or I plus 6, right? So this was at 6, and the first time we go through, we're at 1 plus 6, and then 2 plus 6, and then 3 plus 6, and then 4 plus 6, and we go all the way down to 10 plus 6. And what you'll see us do here is first we have a white background color, we put 1 space, then we have a yellow background color, we put 1 space, okay? White 1 space, yellow 1 space. And then we say if the rod level divided by 10 is greater than or equal to the current number we're at. So if we're at, let's say 10% fuel rod, 10 divided by 10 is 1. If that's greater than or equal to the I letter, so 1, then we set the background color to red. Otherwise, we set it to yellow and write 3 spaces. So that's how we're determining whether or not we're putting red or yellow here, so that when we have, for example, if we switch this guy to manual and set it to 20%, right, the second time through the iteration, so the first time, 20 divided by 1, or 20 divided by 10 is greater than or equal to I, so that's 1. So it writes red. It's greater than or equal to 2, it writes red. Greater than or equal to 3, it is not, so it doesn't write red, it writes yellow. Cool. And then we can set 30 or 60 or whatever amount we want. Cool, right? And then we write a couple more spaces, 1 in yellow, 1 in white. And then at the very end, we write a bunch of white, which just puts the bottom cap down there. Nice and simple. The turbine inductor display, pretty similar the way we do that. So for the turbine, we go ahead and we write some gray colors. The first 7 lines are going to be written as white or gray, and we want to alternate white and gray. So we basically say if I mod 2 equals 0, that's basically a quick way of checking if it's an even or odd number. So it alternates, it does gray versus light gray, and puts the spacing there. And then once that's done, for positions 8, 9, and 10, so the bottom three, 1, 2, 3, it basically checks if the inductor is engaged, and if it is, it makes it red, and if it's not, it makes it blue, and then continues to write the grays and light grays until the rest of the picture is drawn. So when the coils are engaged, it's red, and when the coils are not engaged, it's blue. Cool? And then getClick is just me figuring out where I clicked on the monitor. And now for the find optimal fuel rods function. This is the function that tries to figure out where the optimal fuel rods is. In my reactor, it happens to be 68%. Let's figure out how that works. So the first thing we do is we turn off the reactor. So reactor.setActiveFalse. We want it to completely cool down. So let's actually do this. I'm going to switch the reactor on at full power, and you'll see why I do this in a minute. So we want the cool down completely, right? So we then run the check end, display end, and fuel rod level functions so that it updates all the information on the screen. Remember, check end checks what the current energy values are, display end displays them, and then fuel rod level will display the fuel rod level graphic over here. So we want to keep this monitor updated throughout this process so that the people watching the monitor know what's happening. Now, while the fuel rod temperature is greater than 99, we want to sit here and wait a few seconds. So every second, we're going to check in, and excuse my spacing here, I added this semi-recently and I did not do a good job of spacing it out. But basically what we're going to do here is the following. We're going to check the energy, display the energy, set the fuel rod energy, and then write down finding optimal rod level and tell you what the current temperature is, and waiting for it to get below 99. So as long as the fuel rod level is above 99, we keep doing this. So keep checking until it gets below 99. The reason for this is because we'll be generating lots of steam when we're above 99. So when we're at 2400, the first time we do this, so for example, if I run Reactor right now, what should happen is it's going to be generating a ton of steam. And we want to wait until it gets below 99 so we can get an accurate measurement of how much steam is generated with the fuel rod level at its 99%. So you'll notice it turns off the reactor and it waits for the core temperature to get down below 99°C. Cool? And once it is below 99°C, let's see what happens. I'm just going to turn off the control program for a minute so you can see the next piece. Now, what we want to do is get the hot fluid amount. Sometimes it will still be producing steam even though it's completely turned off because it's still hot. So what we want to do is wait for that to be below 10,000 buckets, or yeah, 10 buckets or 10,000 millibuckets. So what we do is we wait for all that built up backlog of steam to empty out. So just wait for that to empty out. Typically, you're not going to run into that, but I was running into it in my testing, so I just added something. It waits for the current amount of steam in the reactor to get below 10,000 before it's allowed to proceed. Then it sets the control rod levels to 99, sets the reactor on, and it waits for the temperature of the reactor to get above 100 degrees. Because if the reactor was off for a while, like it is now, you'll notice that it's currently at 84°C. And it's offline, and it'll get all the way down to 20. So like, for example, if I were to break and replace this glass, I think it resets the reactor and gets it down to 20. Am I right? No? Okay. Well, anyway, it sets the fuel rods to 99 and it waits for it to get above 100 because 20 is the minimum, and you want to wait until it's above 100 because that's when it starts producing steam. So it's going to wait until it gets above 100. Once it's above 100, it's going to wait 5 seconds, and it's, again, continuously checking the temperatures, and it's just going to wait 5 seconds, so it's going to go through a for loop. Every 1 second, it's going to write the information to the screen and wait 1 second 5 times in a row. And it's just going to wait with the fuel rods at 99 for the temperature's reactor to stabilize, okay? And then we do a bunch of math. So let's watch the reactor function real quick at that level, and then we'll go into all the math that we do. So you can see it's waiting for the core temperature to get above 100°C. And notice we're not producing any steam yet. That's why we waited. Once we hit 100C, that's when we'll start producing steam. Then it's going to wait 5 seconds, and it's going to ensure that we've hit a balanced out point. So after 5 seconds, you can see we were pretty much stable at 59C. That's when it did a bunch of math. So let's turn off the program here and edit the code and see what it's doing. It gets the energy produced last tick, which when it's a steam reactor, that's actually... it's the same function, it's just giving you the steam produced instead of the energy produced. But in the code, it works the same. So it's get the amount of steam produced last tick. It's going to write that out to the computer monitor, and then it's going to set the temperature fuel rod levels to 2,000 divided by that number. So what we're doing is we're calculating how much steam we're producing when the fuel rods are at 99%. So the minimum it can get is 99%, so that's like, you know, the smallest amount. So when we multiply those, or divide that, 2,000 divided by that, we get a rough idea of where the fuel rod levels should be. But remember I said because of the fact that hotter reactors are more efficient, you're going to want to go ahead and just add 5 to that. So it probably would have calculated this around 67%. I added 5 to get it up to 72%. Okay, so that's what it says here, adding 5 levels. We set those control rod levels physically in the reactor to that number, so temp rod levels, and then we wait 10 seconds. So that's where we're at right now when we stop the program. So we set it to 72 and we're waiting 10 seconds. Note that we were producing about 1784. Okay, and with 72, remember our calculated number is somewhere around 67. So if we check here, we wait those 10 seconds. So that's where we're doing the 4, that thing. Did I disconnect this by mistake? I don't even know how I did that from back here. But anyway, we update the monitor. So every second we're just refreshing the information on the monitor, and we wait 10 seconds for the heat to get all the way up there and balance out the steam production. And at that point we can start trying to get it up. So what we do is we say while the temp millibuckets is greater than 2,000, do the following. So if it's above 2,000, we want to start backing it down. So we want to start, adding to the fuel rod level, inserting the rods further down so it produces less steam. Because I'm doing the +5 here, it's unlikely that'll happen, but I still wanted to, check for it. So we say why it's above 5,000, we try and get it below 2,000 millibuckets per tick. Then we check the levels again, and then we do the same. So once we get it below 2,000, we want to slowly bring it up above 2,000. So while it's below 2,000, set the temp rod level -1, and wait 5 seconds until it gets above 2,000 millibuckets per tick. And it writes out what it's currently at. And then at that point, it's determined what the optimal fuel rod level is, and it writes it to that optimal fuel rod level variable. So let's run the reactor program again and see what happens. So again, it's going to sit here and it's going to wait until it gets below 99C, right? Once it's below 99C, it'll turn on the reactor at 99% fuel rod level, wait a few seconds to ensure that we've got a stable amount. 59 for my reactor is where that's at. Then what it's going to do is do all those calculations. It probably came up with 67 and added 5 to it, so it got 72. Now it's waiting 10 seconds for the steam to balance out and make sure we're actually producing a stable amount of steam. So 1791 millibuckets is right about the steam level we're producing. So then it bumps it up by, or it subtracts 1 from the fuel rod, so it's producing a little bit more. Waits 5 seconds and subtracts 1 again. Waits 5 seconds and subtracts 1 again. Waits 5 seconds and subtracts 1 again, and when we get to 68, we'll see that we're above that 2,000 millibuckets per tick. That's what it is for my reactor. Your reactor, if it's a different design, might be different. So it'll come up with different percentages based on the way you built your reactor, if it's a smaller design, if it's a bigger design, what have you. And then it switches into automatic mode, and it remembers that 68% was the optimal fuel rod. So remember, the automatic calculation came up with 67. That's why I added a little bit to it and let it back down so that we ensure we get the right number. Otherwise, we'd kind of be wasting a little bit of fuel. A very small amount of fuel would be wasted, but that's what it is. And we're in the home stretch now. This is the logic that the automatic reactor follows. This is when to turn on and off. So if it's not a steam reactor, if it's just an energy reactor, what it does is when it's in automatic mode, it automatically sets all the control rod levels to 0. And if the energy stored percent, the percentage up there, is less than the turn on value, which is 50, then if the reactor is not currently online, then turn it online. and end. If the energy stored amount is greater than the turn off at, so if it's above 90, then if the reactor is currently online, turn it offline. Cool? Pretty straightforward. Otherwise, so this if follows the else logic here. So if it is a steam reactor, right? If it's not a steam reactor, just turn the reactor on and off. Otherwise, if it is a steam reactor, then set all the control rod levels to the optimal fuel rod. So if I was in manual mode and I was playing around with fuel rod levels and doing whatever I was doing, once I set it to automatic again, the first thing it does is set it to the optimal fuel rod that we calculated earlier, which was 68%. Okay. If the energy stored is less than the turn on at level, then set the turbine online and turn the coils on. Remember, we're not turning on the reactor at this point. The reactor only turns on when the speed here of the rotor is below 1840. And because I've been, leaving the reactor on for a while, the rotor speed is like crazy high right now. So it sets the coils on, and that's what generates power at the turbine level. Okay. If the energy stored is greater than the turn off level, so if it's above 90%, then I commented out this code. I didn't like the way it worked. What I decided to do is just set the turbine online, because the turbine should pretty much always be online. So I always turn the turbine on at this point, and turn off the coils. So the turbine being on or off is just whether or not it can accept steam. But we're really just, disabling the steam at the reactor level. So there's no reason to turn on and off the turbine. I just make sure it's always on. That's just the way it works in the code for me. And then we check the turbine rotor speed. If it's greater than the target speed, which is 1840, then we turn off the reactor. Otherwise, we turn on the reactor. Nice and simple. The display screen function here, we first check the energy and display the energy, which is displaying the information on top. And then if the menu type is reactor, then we run the fuel rod level function. So the first thing we display is the fuel rod levels. And if we're in automatic mode, then we display the auto menu and run the auto reactor function, which determines whether or not to turn on the reactor. And otherwise, we run the manual menu, and we don't run the auto reactor function, so it doesn't calculate whether or not to turn on and off the reactor. So in manual mode, it displays the manual menu, and in automatic mode, it displays the automatic menu. Pretty cool. Turbine inductor display. So if it's not reactor mode, right, if it's turbine menu, then we call the turbine inductor display, which displays that fancy little graphic over there. And if the mode is automatic, then we run turbine auto menu function, which displays this, and run the auto reactor function, the same thing. Or we run the turbine manual menu, which displays that thing. End. Now for a little bit of complicatedness. So we've done displaying things. Now what we want to do is either wait for the player to click on something, or wait a second or two and update the monitor. So this is where things get tricky. So we start a timer in the timer code for 1 second, and then we pull an event. So local event side XY. And we repeat this over and over. The event side XY is an OS pull event. So timers in Computercraft can either fire an event after their timer expires, so that's every 1 second it'll fire an event, but also a player clicking on the monitor will fire an event. So what we want to do is we want to catch the event and then determine whether it's a timer or it was the player clicking on the monitor. However, because we're doing this so often, every 1 second, every time you do this start timer, you can get a timer code. So that's like a special unique identifier for that timer. So the first thing we check for when the event fires is if it was a timer event. And if the timer code, is right here, it's stored in the side variable, but it's the timer code basically when it's a timer. So what we do is we check the code that started this, and if it's not the same as the code that we received from the pull event, then we print wrong code. Otherwise, we print right code. And, we keep doing that until either the event is not a timer. So if it was, for example, me clicking on the monitor, or the timer code is equal to the timer code we got. So we basically wait for the same timer code from the timer we started earlier. And, if those two are the same, then we end this loop of repeat until. Or if it's not a timer event. For example, I clicked on the monitor. So if the event is monitor touch, then we call that button check XY, which is what calculates which button I clicked, and, proceed from there. So this way, it's just updating the monitor every 1 second, basically, and still waiting for a player to click on a button. Otherwise, it would be really hard to update the monitor and check for a player clicking on it. Cool? And this is the very end of the code. The first thing we do, right? So these were all functions until then. This is what actually runs. This is like your main program. The first thing we do is if it's a steam reactor, we run that find optimal fuel rods thing. So the first thing we do, one time only, find the optimal fuel rods, but only if it's a steam reactor. And then, while true, display screen, which is, this code right here. So we basically over and over and over again just display this screen information. So every second, we're checking energy and displaying energy. We're updating the information on the screen up there and, going into automatic or manual mode. And that timer thing here, every 1 second, is how often this is running. So it keeps going every 1 second, updating the information on the screen and allowing the player to click on stuff. Pretty cool. And that pretty much covers it, guys. I don't think there's much else to really talk about in this code. It's pretty neat. I mean, it's not perfect. I'm sure there's better ones out there, but it works for me. It turns on when it needs to. It turns off when it needs to. It calculates optimal fuel level usage. I considered in reactor mode, like trying to regularly check the energy use and adjusting the fuel rod insertion to match the energy use. That's maybe something I'll add later down the line. It's something I could probably do, but just not something I'm ready to do at this point. So for now, I'll just kind of leave it where it, turns on at 50% and turns off at 90%. That's kind of your best bet for real. Yeah, so that's the computer craft code for the Reactor program. Hope you guys enjoyed checking it out, those of you who are interested in computer craft code and how it works. For now, Daryl20 signing off. Take it easy.